thank you very much, Congressman Pittenger, for inviting me, and Senator Tillis, and thanks to all of you for coming to Washington for this conference. I think it's critically important that parliamentarians from all around the democratic world have opportunities to exchange views on the whole range of issues that you confront, but especially this one, to confront the national security issues, because certainly in U.S. politics, I don't think our political leaders spend enough time talking about national security, given the importance of it to our country and our friends and allies. We're about to go into a presidential cycle. We're actually in it already. We've been in it. It seems like it never ends, but in presidential cycles, we do tend to talk more about national security, and I really believe that in the 2024 campaigns, the U.S. does confront more national security issues, and it's going to be even more important. But when you get down to it, who does the legislation, who does the funding, who makes the key decisions, it's members of our respective national legislatures. So your involvement in this activity, I just think, is really important. And one of the problems that we all face, certainly that I and others struggle with in trying to define what our national security policy is the breadth of threats that we face. I mean, I'll oversimplify here for emphasis, but, in the Cold War, it was pretty straightforward from our point of view where the threat was, and it was pretty straightforward what we had to do to deter Soviet aggression. We got through the Cold War without a nuclear exchange. We had wars along the periphery that were costly and devastating, but we didn't have a hot Third World War. After that, you'll remember in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall came down, the Warsaw Pact crumbled, we had people telling us we had reached the end of history, that there were no more threats. In the West, a lot of people talked about the peace dividend, which meant, in their mind, they could cut our defense and intelligence budgets to the bone, which they then proceeded to do, and which we're still trying to recover from. In the U.S., and I think many other countries, we had an awakening on 9/11 in 2001 with the terrorist attacks on Washington and New York, but now, just 20 years later, even in this country, it's hard to get people to focus on external threats. And I just want to run through some of them, because part of the problem that we face today is that there are so many threats to national security. The battle space has expanded in many, many ways, well beyond conventional warfare, well beyond guerrilla warfare and terrorism, in the world of asymmetric threats and new threats, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, fraud, deception, stealing intellectual property, influence operations in national elections, and in the overall formulation of national opinion through debates, getting into universities. I mean, this is a very, very broad spectrum of threats. And so, I think we all tend to reflect our experience and background. We become familiar with one set of threats, we focus on them, whereas in the meantime, there are other threats that are emerging. And I think some of the adversaries that I want to talk about today have perceived this potential for asymmetric warfare much better than we have. So I think we've all got a job to do to try and catch up and get a handle across the board, because when you're threatened in the economic sphere and the political sphere, as well as the military and intelligence spheres, you've got more work to do. And this is something we have to explain to our respective publics, that meeting these threats, deterring the challenges, requires the expenditure of resources. And in a difficult budgetary situation, I don't need to explain to any of you, there are hard trade-offs that you have to make between the demands of some in our publics for more domestic expenditures versus what I think political leaders see better than others, the importance of protecting the ring around our society so that they can continue to function in a strong way. And I think just in the past couple of years, we have seen the growth of these threats in a number of ways. And so let me try and run through them, and then we will have time for some questions. I don't want to hold up the rest of your program, and there's a lot to cover, but I do want to try and be responsive to your questions. So let's start with what I believe is just my personal opinion now was a grave mistake by the United States, manifested in the summer of 2021, but begun during the prior administration, and that is the U.S. and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. This was due to political pressure in large part here in the United States. People talked about ending the endless wars. But the fact was, while Afghanistan and the situation there was far from perfect, from the U.S. and NATO point of view, we had accomplished the central objective we had gone in to achieve, which was to prevent terrorist attacks emanating from the soil of Afghanistan for over 20 years. Now, our withdrawal has created a power vacuum. The terrorists are beginning to fill. We've had testimony from the Biden administration that the potential threat of a terrorist attack from Afghanistan is now real. Now over a year since the withdrawal. We gave up intelligence capabilities in a country with one nuclear power, Pakistan to the east, and an imminent nuclear power, Iran to the west, let alone the window on terrorists coming in and using Afghanistan as a base. Gave up important facilities that Russia or China could take advantage of. But I think most importantly of all, we said to the would-be aggressors that the United States is retreating, that we left Afghanistan and got nothing in return, nothing. And for some, even worse, we abandoned the Afghan people. NATO had been there for over 20 years, which means if you take kind of knowledge of the world as a whole beginning at age 5, there's nobody under 25 in Afghanistan that remembers a world when we weren't there. Well, now they're finding out what it's like, to all of our dismay. So this fundamental decision, I think, has affected the calculations of would-be aggressors all around the world, and it's not to our advantage across the spectrum of threats, from terrorism and guerrilla activities, really, to all the asymmetric challenges that you're going to be taking up. And I think, unfortunately, you can draw a direct line from the withdrawal of Afghanistan in the summer of 2021 to Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th of this year. I think the Kremlin looked at that. They looked back and had been thinking for some time about the totally inadequate response of the West to the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the illegal annexation of the Crimea, the occupation through irregular forces of a chunk of the Donbass, with a minimal Western response. And they said, well, we didn't get as far as we wanted to in Ukraine in 2014, but we didn't pay much of a price for it. This withdrawal from Afghanistan tells us something about the United States. Now's the time to try it again in Ukraine. Now, the fact is, through a combination of circumstances, the remarkable performance of the Ukrainian military, the resolve of the Ukrainian people, the assistance that the U.S. and Britain and Poland and many other NATO members have provided to Ukraine in terms of resources and intelligence, and let's be honest, the appallingly bad performance of the Russian military has minimized the territory that they've taken, has begun to roll them back, but we're still in a situation where Ukraine faces cyber attacks. We've seen, as they say, the Russians try to weaponize winter by destroying Ukraine's power-generating infrastructure. Russians have done that over the centuries, as Napoleon and Hitler can both attest to, and now they're trying to do it to Ukraine. So putting stress on the civilian population in ways most of us consider illegitimate, trying to destroy the economy, if not through conventional military means, by all of these asymmetrical things, and probably others that they haven't tried yet. They are testing our resolve to the limit. And I think what the Kremlin's hope now is is that because more economic pressure at this point, not success on the battlefield, but success in breaking the resolve of the Ukrainian people or breaking the resolve of the NATO alliance, they can prevail politically where they failed to succeed militarily. Now, I don't have any doubt that the Russians will fail to break the resolve of the Ukrainian people. I don't think that's going to happen. What I do worry about is the resolve of the rest of us in the West. When we see polls in this country, when we see comments made by European leaders about finding off-ramps for the Russians, finding ways to address their concerns about the eastward expansion of NATO, which is a Russian talking point. NATO didn't press to expand to the east. The Eastern and Central European countries came to NATO and said, for God's sakes, don't let us be taken over by the Russians again. That's why NATO expanded. But this is, now we're in the field of psychological warfare. We're talking about Russian influence operations across Europe and North America. This is a real testing time of our ability to withstand Russia's efforts to defeat the economic sanctions and impose economic cost on us rather than us imposing economic cost on them. This is a very important test case because I think there's little doubt, if you remember what Vladimir Putin said back in 2005, his famous statement that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And quite obviously what he's trying to do is fix that from his point of view. Not to recreate the Soviet Union, but to recreate the Russian Empire. So it's not just Ukraine that's vulnerable, it's every other independent state formerly part of the Soviet Union. And that is, this is a test of how well we can withstand and roll back this unprovoked aggression. I think we have to acknowledge we failed at the beginning in the most important aspect. We failed to deter the Russians. And I think deterrence, again, across this full spectrum, not just on the nuclear side, not just in terms of conventional weapons, but considering cyber attacks, influence operations, economic warfare, how you deter the attack in the first place. It's an easy word to say, but I'll tell you, during the Cold War, nuclear deterrence was the most intellectually challenging thing that went on in the West to try and deter the beginning of a nuclear war. And I'm worried that we have, having escaped that threat with the collapse of the Soviet Union, our thinking on deterrence has become very unsophisticated. It's very unsophisticated, particularly in cyberspace. Where for many years, I think people thought of cyberspace as kind of the Garden of Eden, and they didn't want to militarize it and do all those bad things to it. Well, our adversaries were militarizing it. You know, cyberspace is a domain of human activity. Just like every other domain of human activity, it's going to be filled with human frailties as well as human strengths, and we need to get used to it. We need to have, as we are developing, offensive cyber capabilities, not just defensive measures to protect against cyber espionage, cyber thievery, cyber attacks, but to be able to strike against our adversaries, to convince them that they will pay a higher price than anything they can possibly gain by their nefarious activities. And I think we're seeing that in the Ukraine conflict today. And then all of this, all of these lessons, everything we're experiencing in Ukraine, I think we should be very clear-eyed here, is being analyzed with great care in Beijing. Because we see there, I think, the existential threat of the 21st century. Not the only threat, not something where we can ignore the rest of the world to deal with the threat from Beijing, but a source that's now growing in strength because one of the consequences of the war in Ukraine is that Russia is being pushed into Beijing's arms. There's an entente there. It's the reverse of the Cold War relationship. China's the dominant partner, Russia's the junior partner. And they've got Iran as one of their surrogates, and North Korea is one of their surrogates as well. China is watching how the West responds to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. It's watching how well we do in the enforcement of our economic sanctions, how effective we are, how willing we are to bear costs economically when we impose sanctions on an aggressor. And I think the Chinese know quite well that in the case of their relations with Europe and the United States, the economic ties are much deeper, much more extensive than any of our economic ties were with Russia. So when we impose sanctions on Russia, the cost to us is slightly higher gasoline prices at the pump, and that's disturbing to a lot of politicians. That's nothing compared to the cost that we'll pay in economic warfare with China, because we let our guard down for 30 years. We put supply chain capital investments in China. We didn't pay attention to the political risk involved. We left ourselves exposed in some of the most sensitive areas at the high-tech end of our economies. And now, late but better late than never, we're beginning to realize that political risk is back in the world, and the threat of China's ability to suspend manufacture of things we take for granted, phones and laptop computers and the like, gives them more economic power than we really anticipated. Now, this is an extraordinarily complicated subject, but something that we all need to think about, because certainly China's thinking about it. But they're also thinking, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, where their military force can be applied along their periphery. And notwithstanding the centralization of power that Xi Jinping has achieved in the 20th Communist Party Congress, he's now the strongest Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. You can see the Chinese people are still discontented. They still remember what it's like to have freedom. They haven't given up. And where they haven't given up in particular is in Taiwan, which is probably the focal point for much of our concern about what China may be up to. And I think we have to remember over the next couple of years what authoritarian societies do when they have domestic difficulties. They try and divert the attention of their population by creating an external crisis. The position of Beijing is that Taiwan is part of China. That's what they call their one China policy. Our one China policy is something different, which is that the people on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait should decide by peaceful means what they want to do. The Taiwanese have decided they want to be independent. And you can say, well, but they're really Chinese. You could have said to Americans in 1776, come on, you're really English, you can't be independent. Tell it to the Taiwanese. I think they are Ukrainians of East Asia, and I think we have to do, all of us, what we can to make sure that we deter Beijing from even thinking about military activity or thinking of creating the pretext of a crisis to give them an excuse to throw a blockade around Taiwan and hope that we back down. Well, look, I'm just getting started. These are a few of the threats that we face. It is a more dangerous world today than we hoped for with the collapse of communism in 1991, but it's the reality. And so, again, I just want to say how much we appreciate all of you coming to Washington and participating in this conference. It's really critical that we get to know each other and we have communications at all levels, but especially at the legislative level. It's an honor for me to be here, and I think we've got a few minutes, Congressman. I'd be happy to answer any questions your group may have.
Please.